Have you ever stood in the profound silence that follows a devastating storm? Not the tranquility of peace, but the heavy, waiting hush of a world that has exhaled its last breath, only to be reborn. This was the air that cloaked the earth as the final waters of the great flood receded, leaving behind a planet washed clean, scarred yet pure. Upon the peaks of Ararat, the great ark rested, a silent testament to both the judgment and the mercy of the Creator. When the massive door creaked open, one family emerged, not as survivors returning home, but as the very seeds of a new humanity. Noah, the man who walked with God in the midst of a corrupt generation, now carried the weight of a second Adam upon his shoulders. His gaze swept over a horizon where the sun cast its first rays upon a land with no memory of sin. But in that pristine emptiness, was the seed of human frailty truly erased, or did it lie dormant, waiting to sprout once more in the soil of the very souls who had been saved? Beside him stood his 3 sons, the 3 pillars of the world to come, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They were more than brothers. They were the headwaters from which the entire ocean of humanity would flow. Shem, the eldest, possessed a quiet and contemplative reverence. His eyes seemed always turned heavenward, searching for divine guidance. His prayers were as natural as breath, and his gait had the careful dignity of one who knew he walked on holy ground. He was the bearer of the sacred promise, a legacy of faith. Japheth, the second son, had a spirit as wide and expansive as his name suggested. He looked upon the world with an explorer's curiosity, yearning to chart the distant lands and broaden the dwelling places for generations to come. He was the embodiment of expansion, of strength, and the will to journey forth. And then there was Ham. If Shem was a whispered prayer and Japheth a call to the horizon, Ham was the vibrant heartbeat of creation itself. He was the most dynamic, the most innovative, his hands always itching to build, his mind restless with discovery. While Shem gazed at the heavens and Japheth toward the skyline, Ham looked down at the earth beneath his feet. He was the first to see the potential in the clay, the strength in the stone, and the suppleness in the wood. He saw cities yet unbuilt, tools yet uncrafted, empires yet unformed. The energy within him was like a river in flood, powerful and, at times, impetuous. Yet, this same fire forged within him a quiet insecurity. He loved and respected his father, the hero of the flood. He admired the piety of his elder brother Shem, but sometimes he felt like a shadow. Shem's holiness seemed to eclipse his own practical genius. He could build a shelter more resilient than any other, but his prayers, he felt, did not ascend as high as Shem's. He yearned to be recognized, not merely as a son of Noah, but as Ham, the architect, the builder. Was there a place in this new world for a legacy forged by human hands, and not just by pure faith? In those first days, they worked in unison. Under Noah's direction, they built the first shelters and planted the first seeds. The sound of hammers and axes broke the primordial hush, a rhythm of new beginnings. But even within that harmony, invisible fractures began to appear. Ham, with the impatience of a creator, sometimes found the traditional methods of his father and brother to be too slow, too cautious. He would propose new designs, daring techniques, only to be met with a gentle shake of Noah's head or a contemplative silence from Shem. They saw peril in rapid innovation. He saw stagnation in clinging to the past. One evening, as the setting sun painted the clouds over Ararat in hues of fire and gold, Ham stood alone on a hillside, gazing down at the small family settlement. He saw his father walking alone, his figure etched with a profound weariness. The burden of an entire world rested on that man's stooped shoulders. Ham felt a deep love for him, yet it was mingled with a sense of distance. He could not comprehend his father's inner world, just as he felt his father did not fully comprehend the burning ambition within his own heart. The seed of division was sown not from hatred, but from a difference that could not be reconciled, from conflicting visions of how the future should be built. And it was in that fragile space between love and pride that a fateful trial was waiting, a trial that would forever reshape his legacy and that of his descendants. After the initial labor of planting essential crops, Noah undertook a deeply symbolic act. He planted a vineyard. The grapevine, with its ability to transform sunlight and rain into clusters of sweet fruit, was an affirmation of hope, life, and abundance in the cleansed earth. It was more than agriculture. It was an act of artistry, an attempt to bring forth joy and comfort into a world being rebuilt from nothing. As seasons turned, the vines grew, blossomed, and bore fruit. The first harvest was a moment of quiet celebration. Noah, with the wisdom of his long years, personally crushed the grapes, letting the juice ferment in earthen jars. He did not know he was unleashing a power with two faces, one that could gladden the heart and one that could cloud the mind. In the world before the flood, wine was likely known, but for this small family on a new planet, it was a near primordial discovery. One evening, weary from a long day of labor, Noah sat alone in his tent. The weight of being the patriarch of all humanity was, at times, an unbearable burden. He remembered the lost world, the faces of those he knew, both good and evil, all washed away. He was the sole bridge between two ages, and the loneliness was immense. Seeking a measure of solace, he drank the fermented juice he had made. Its warm, sweet strength spread through his limbs, easing his mind. He drank more, and then more again, until the sharp edges of his consciousness began to soften. Intoxication came not as an enemy, but as a release from his heavy charge. In this state of unguarded stupor, Noah cast off his garments and fell into a deep, vulnerable sleep, naked and exposed. It was a moment of raw, unveiled truth. The hero of the flood, the one righteous man of a generation, was also just a man of flesh and blood, with his own frailties and limits. It was then that Ham approached his father's tent. He had a question for him, perhaps about a new design for an irrigation channel or an idea for expanding their settlement. He entered without announcement, and the sight before him stopped him in his tracks. His father, the man he had always looked up to with a mixture of awe and reverence, lay there, unclothed, lost in a drunken sleep, stripped of his usual patriarchal dignity. In that instant, Ham did not see his father through the eyes of compassion. He did not see an exhausted old man seeking a moment's escape. Instead, he saw the collapse of an icon. For Ham, who had always felt he lived in his father's immense shadow, it was a shocking revelation. The great patriarch, the man who spoke with God, was merely mortal, as fallible as anyone else. A wave of disappointment washed over him, but it was followed by a more subtle feeling, a surge of youthful self-importance. Instead of quietly taking a cloth to cover his father and departing, Ham turned and walked out. He went to Shem and Japheth, who were working nearby. "Come and see," he said, his voice a mixture of astonishment and a subtle, unseemly triumph. "Our father is drunk and lying uncovered in his tent." Ham's action was not born of pure malicious mockery. It was more complex. It was an implicit declaration, an outburst from the son who felt undervalued. It was his way of saying, "You see, the one we all revere is not perfect. Perhaps my ideas, my ways of seeing the world, are just as valid." It was an act of pride, an attempt to pull his deified father down to his own level. The reaction of Shem and Japheth was a study in contrasts. When they heard Ham's words, no curiosity sparked in their eyes, only concern and reverence. They spoke not a word to Ham. Silently, they took a garment, laid it across both their shoulders, and together walked backward into the tent. Their gazes were fixed outward, determined not to witness their father's exposure. They carefully covered Noah with the robe. Their action was a silent, powerful lesson in honor, filial piety, and wisdom. They understood that to honor one's parent is not to honor their perfection, but to honor the position and role God has given them. They had protected their father's dignity, while Ham, in a single moment of brash self-assertion, had exposed it. He did not understand that in shaming his father, he was cracking the very foundation of his own family, the only family on earth. The seed of disrespect had been sown, and it would soon grow into a tree bearing bitter fruit, not just for him, but for a generation yet to come. As the first light of the next day filtered into the tent, Noah slowly awoke. A dull ache throbbed in his head, and the memories of the previous evening were hazy, like a fading dream. But when he saw the garment laid carefully over him, a robe that was not his own, he knew something had happened. The silence of the settlement felt heavier than usual. He summoned his sons, and from Ham's downcast eyes and the respectful quiet of Shem and Japheth, Noah understood the whole story. His reaction was not the hot fury of a man whose pride was wounded. There were no shouts, no bitter recriminations. Instead, a profound sorrow filled his eyes, the sorrow of a father and a prophet. He saw not just Ham's past action, he saw a distant future, a chain of consequences stretching across generations. The words he was about to speak were not a curse uttered in anger, but a prophecy, a revelation of where the choices of today would lead. He looked at Ham, but his gaze seemed to pass through him to his future, to his lineage. And then he spoke, his voice low and resonant, directing his words not at Ham, but at Ham's son, Canaan. Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants he shall be to his brothers. Why Canaan? Why not Ham, the one who had committed the offense? This is the point that has been misunderstood and twisted for centuries. It was not an arbitrary punishment, displacing blame onto an innocent grandson. In the ancient mindset, especially that of a prophet like Noah, a person was not merely an individual. They were part of a lineage, and the character and tendencies of the father were often passed down and magnified in the son. Noah, through divine insight, saw the seed of pride and disrespect that Ham had sown. He foresaw that this seed would take its deepest root and bear its most toxic fruit in the line of Canaan. His words were not a sentence, damning Canaan and his descendants for all time. Rather, they were a sorrowful prediction of the spiritual path they would choose. To be a servant of servants was not just about physical slavery. It carried a deeper meaning of spiritual bondage. By choosing to dishonor the divine order, represented by the father, the line of Canaan would place itself in servitude to baser things, to idolatry, to moral decay, and to rebellion against God. They would become servants to their own passions. Then Noah turned to his other two sons. He blessed them, not for their perfection, but for choosing the path of honor and respect. "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem," he declared, "and may Canaan be his servant." This blessing placed Shem's line in a special covenant relationship with God, the line that would carry the prophets, the law, and ultimately, the Messiah. "May God enlarge Japheth," he continued, "and may he dwell in the tents of Shem." This was an astonishing prophecy of future unity, when the peoples of Japheth, representing the Gentiles, would one day be invited into the tents of Shem, that is, to share in the divine covenant originally given to Shem's descendants. The episode in the tent was no longer a simple family scandal. It had become a crossroads in human history. Three sons, through their choices, had set three different trajectories for their posterity. Ham, by his action, was not cast out by God, but he had opened a path of spiritual struggle for one branch of his family. Noah's prophecy was like a map drawn before the journey began. It did not force anyone down a particular road, but it warned of the pitfalls and dangerous destinations that lay ahead if one chose the wrong turn. The legacy of Ham, from this moment, was fractured. While his other sons would go on to build great empires, the line of Canaan would face a constant struggle against a darkness they had invited. The prophecy had been spoken, and the wheels of history began to turn, carrying with them both the promise of blessing and the warning of consequence. As Noah's family began to disperse across the face of the earth, carrying with them their blessings and prophecies, a new chapter opened for the sons of Ham. Despite the shadow of the prophecy that clung to Canaan's name, his brothers Kush, Mizraim, and Put did not step into the future as men burdened by shame. Instead, they carried within them their father's fire of innovation and a resilient will. They were pioneers and builders, and their journeys would write some of the most glorious pages in human history. Kush, Ham's eldest son, turned his face to the south. His migration was not a flight, but a quest. He and his clan followed ancient pathways, crossing arid deserts until they found the fertile lands fed by the great rivers south of Egypt. This was the region that would later be known as Nubia, Ethiopia, and Sudan, a land of the burning sun, of dark-skinned people with an indomitable spirit. Was it a coincidence that this branch of Ham's line settled in a land so rich in resources? The lands of Kush were laden with gold, ivory, and precious spices. His descendants did not live a simple nomadic life. They harnessed the wealth of the land and built a powerful civilization, a kingdom known to history as the Kingdom of Kush. They were not a forgotten people on the world's periphery. They were a formidable power, a rival, and at times even the ruler of the mighty Egyptian empire to the north. History records that the 25th dynasty of Egypt was, in fact, the Kushite Dynasty, when black pharaohs from Nubia sat on the throne, ruling one of the greatest empires of the ancient world. Consider that for a moment. The descendants of Ham, the very line that later interpreters would mistakenly label as cursed, were seated on the thrones of the pharaohs, bringing an era of stability and cultural renaissance to the land of their kinsmen, Mizraim. Was this an irony of history, or was it a powerful reminder from God that his plans are never limited by human prejudice? But the legacy of Kush was not merely one of power and wealth. It was also a legacy of wisdom and a deep spiritual thirst. From this line emerged one of the most mysterious and compelling female figures in the Bible, the Queen of Sheba. Hearing of King Solomon's great wisdom, she undertook a long and arduous journey from her wealthy kingdom in the south. She did not come to conquer or to flaunt her riches. She came in search of truth. She brought with her hard questions, philosophical and spiritual riddles, to test the divine wisdom given to Solomon. The meeting between the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon was more than a diplomatic event. It was a dialogue between civilizations, an intersection of the legacy of Ham and the legacy of Shem. And when the Queen heard Solomon's answers and witnessed the prosperity of his kingdom, she did not praise the king. She praised his God. "Blessed be the Lord your God," she declared. Jesus himself would later hold her up as an example of a truth seeker, a witness who would rise against those who rejected God's wisdom. A woman from the line of Kush became a symbol of faith for all time, and that legacy continued to flow. Centuries later, another man from the line of Kush, an Ethiopian eunuch, a high-ranking official in the royal court, was on his way home from Jerusalem. He sat in his chariot, reading from the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, his heart puzzled by the ancient words. It was then that the Holy Spirit sent the evangelist Philip to explain the scriptures to him, revealing Jesus. Instantly, the official believed and asked to be baptized. He became one of the first recorded African converts, carrying the fire of the gospel back to his continent. The golden stream of the south was not just a stream of material gold. It was a current of faith, of wisdom, of people chosen by God to play pivotal roles in his story of redemption. From warrior kings to wise queens, from truth seekers to gospel bearers, the legacy of Kush is a powerful testament that God never forgets any of his peoples. He planted seeds of greatness in the southern soil, and they blossomed brilliantly, bringing glory to his name through the ages. While Kush was forging his kingdoms in the south, another of Ham's sons, Mizraim, led his clan to a land that would become the cradle of one of the most magnificent and enigmatic civilizations in human history. They settled along the banks of a long, majestic river, a river whose cycles of flood and retreat dictated life and death, prosperity and famine. This was the Nile, and the land was Egypt. The very name Mizraim in Hebrew can mean the two lands, perhaps alluding to Upper and Lower Egypt, the two realms that would unite to create an empire that endured for millennia. The descendants of Mizraim were not simple farmers living by the grace of the river. They were brilliant architects, profound astronomers, gifted physicians, and master administrators. They transformed a desert landscape into a powerhouse of knowledge and authority. Have you ever wondered how an ancient civilization could erect the Great Pyramids of Giza, monuments so vast and precise they defy modern imagination? How they could chart the heavens with such accuracy as to create one of the world's first solar calendars? How they developed sophisticated medical techniques, including surgery and embalming, thousands of years before the Common Era? The answer lies in the creative spark they inherited from their forefather, Ham. They were builders, dreamers who made their visions into stone reality. But the story of Mizraim, of Egypt, within the biblical narrative, is one of profound paradox. This land would play a dual role in God's divine drama. It was both a sanctuary and a prison, a place of life-giving providence and a crucible of faith, testing affliction. Consider the early pages of Genesis. When a great famine swept over Canaan, where did Abraham find refuge? In Egypt. Though he faced trials there, he left Egypt wealthier than he had arrived. Generations later, the pattern repeated on a grander scale. Joseph, the favored son of Jacob, was sold into slavery by his own brothers and taken to Egypt. He arrived in the land of Mizraim in chains, but by God's grace, he rose from prisoner to prime minister, the second most powerful man in the empire. Egypt became the salvation of Jacob's entire family, preserving the chosen line from starvation. Was the rise of the Egyptian empire perfectly timed by God to shelter the fledgling nation of Israel? Through the descendants of Mizraim, God enacted his plan of preservation. But the story did not end there. The wheel of history turned, and Egypt's role shifted. The children of Israel multiplied and grew strong, and fear crept into the heart of a new Pharaoh, one who did not know Joseph. The land of refuge became a house of bondage. The descendants of Mizraim, who had once benefited from Joseph's wisdom, now became brutal oppressors. The crack of the whip replaced the welcome, and the cries of Hebrew slaves ascended to the heavens. Egypt, in all its splendor and knowledge, set itself in opposition to God, and it was here, in the land of Mizraim, that God performed some of his mightiest wonders. The 10 plagues were not merely punishments for Pharaoh, they were a systematic dismantling of the power of the Egyptian gods. The Nile, their source of life, turned to blood. The sky, from which they charted the stars, was plunged into darkness. The power of the great empire was humbled before the strength of the living God. Yet, even in judgment, God's redemptive purpose was never absent. Centuries after the Exodus, the prophet Isaiah spoke an astonishing prophecy. "Blessed be Egypt, my people, Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel my inheritance." It is almost unimaginable. Egypt, Israel's great antagonist, would one day be called my people by God. What does this reveal about the nature of God? It reveals that no nation, no people, is beyond the reach of his grace. And the circle of history closed in the most beautiful way. Millennia after it served as a prison for the Israelites, Egypt once again became a place of refuge. When the cruel King Herod sought to kill the infant Jesus, where did Joseph and Mary flee? To Egypt. The land of Mizraim sheltered the Messiah himself. The legacy of Mizraim is a profound lesson in the complexity of history and the sovereignty of God. He can raise a nation from the dust and humble an empire in a single night. He can use the wisdom of a people to train great leaders like Moses, and he can use that same people as a furnace to refine the faith of his chosen ones. Mizraim was not just the father of a nation, he was the source of a grand stage upon which some of the most spectacular dramas of God's power, judgment, and mercy would be performed. As we trace the lineages of Ham, moving from the golden kingdoms of Kush and the mighty empire of Mizraim, we arrive at a name often overlooked, a figure seemingly more silent in the symphony of history, Put, the third son. The scriptures mention him less frequently, but this silence does not signify an absence of legacy. The legacy of Put was not inscribed on towering pyramids or magnificent temples. It was written on the sands of the desert, forged in the heat of the sun, and embodied in the unconquerable spirit of the warrior. Historians and biblical scholars associate Put with the peoples of North Africa, a vast expanse stretching west of Egypt, encompassing modern-day Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. This was a world of powerful tribes, strategic port cities, and vast deserts that held more than just sand. The descendants of Put were those who tamed the harshness of the desert, making it their home. Among them, the Libyans stand out as renowned warriors, known for their skill in battle and courage. They were not barbarians. They had a distinct culture and, at times, rose to great power. Egyptian history records the 22nd dynasty as being of Libyan origin, when a pharaoh named Shoshenq I, called Shishak in the Bible, ascended the throne. It was this king, a descendant of Put, who led a massive army to invade Jerusalem during the reign of King Rehoboam, plundering the treasures of Solomon's temple. The Bible records that his army was too numerous to count, including Libyans and Kushites. What does this show? It shows that the sons of Ham, though from different branches, often formed powerful military alliances. Further west, in the land of modern-day Tunisia, another power arose that would shake the ancient world, Carthage. While founded by the Phoenicians, descendants of Canaan, the strength of Carthage was deeply reliant on its alliance with the native Berber and Libyan tribes, the descendants of Put. They provided soldiers, trade goods, and an intimate knowledge of the land. The prophet Ezekiel, describing the military might of the city of Tyre, wrote, "Persia and Lud and Put were in your army as your men of war." Once again, the people of Put are named as warriors, as skilled mercenaries. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Put is found in the Berber peoples, often called the people of the desert. They were nomads, the guardians of the Sahara. They established trans-Saharan trade routes long before the rise of Rome or Islam, transporting gold, salt, and knowledge across the vast wasteland. They lived a life of freedom and resilience, with a rich oral culture. Through thousands of years of invasion and colonization by Romans, Vandals, Arabs, and Europeans, the Berbers have endured. Their language, one of the oldest still spoken, is preserved to this day. Is this resilience not part of the legacy Put left behind? A remarkable adaptability, a spirit that refuses to be conquered. They were the silent sentinels of the desert, an invisible but ever-present force on the stage of history. In the prophecies, Put is often mentioned alongside Kush and Egypt, typically in the context of judgment. Ezekiel speaks of a day when the sword will come upon Egypt. Put and Lud, all Arabia, Libya, and the people of the covenant land will fall by the sword along with them. These words speak of the consequences for nations that chose idolatry and opposed God's authority. But even in judgment, their presence is not forgotten. They are an integral part of the prophetic landscape. The legacy of Put teaches us a vital lesson. Not all legacies are measured in monuments or written laws. Some legacies are demonstrated in strength, endurance, and the ability to survive. The descendants of Put may not have built pyramids, but they built invisible bridges of trade across the desert. They may not have left vast libraries, but they preserved an ancient culture in their memory and traditions. They were the warriors, the survivors, the guardians of the ancient world. And God, in his wisdom, wove these quiet but powerful threads into the grand tapestry of human history. He showed that strength is found not only in splendid empires, but also in the unbreakable spirit of those who know how to live and fight in the harshest of lands. Our journey now brings us back to the last son of Ham, the one whose name became synonymous with both a promised land and a tragic warning: Canaan. His story does not begin with migrations to distant lands, but at the very crossroads of destiny, under the shadow of a prophecy spoken in sorrow by Noah. Cursed be Canaan. Those words have echoed through generations, but were they a permanent sentence, or were they a foresight into a path a people would choose for themselves? The descendants of Canaan did not fade into the wilderness. On the contrary, they settled in one of the most strategic and fertile regions of the world, the strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, a natural bridge connecting Africa, Asia, and Europe. They became master city builders, brilliant merchants, and skilled artisans. From the line of Canaan arose legendary cities. Sidon and Tyre, the great Phoenician seaports, commanded maritime trade, carrying not only goods but the world's first phonetic alphabet to the west. Jericho, one of the oldest cities on earth, stood formidably with its massive walls. The Hittites forged a powerful empire, and the Jebusites established a stronghold on the hill that would one day become Jerusalem, the holy city for 3 world faiths. On the surface, Canaanite civilization was sophisticated and brilliant. They had architecture, laws, art, and a complex religious system. They had turned their region into a land flowing with milk and honey, but beneath this glorious facade, a spiritual rot had begun to spread, just as Noah's prophecy had foretold. The seed of disrespect had blossomed into a forest of depravity. The problem with the Canaanites was not that they lacked religion, it was that their religion had become dark and brutal. They did not simply turn away from the Creator, they embraced the most abhorrent practices. Their gods, such as Baal and Molech, demanded grotesque rituals. Horrifically, this included child sacrifice. Iron altars were heated until they glowed red, and fathers and mothers would place their own infant children upon them as offerings, believing this would appease the gods and ensure a good harvest. Can you imagine a land where the screams of burning children mingled with hymns of worship? This was the reality of Canaan. The land itself was being defiled by the blood of the innocent. They practiced ritual prostitution in their temples and engaged in sorcery, divination, and necromancy, opening doors to dark spiritual forces. The creative gifts they had inherited were twisted to serve destruction. This is why, when God called the nation of Israel out of Egypt, he did not merely promise them a land, he gave them a mission to cleanse that land. Joshua's conquest of Canaan was not an act of ethnic imperialism or genocide. It was an act of divine judgment, much like the flood before it, intended to remove a spiritual cancer that threatened to metastasize across the world. God was clear with Israel. It is not because of your righteousness that you are going in to possess their land, but it is because of the wickedness of these nations. The war against the Canaanites was a spiritual war. The fall of Jericho's walls, the victory over the Amorite kings as the sun stood still, these were acts of divine intervention to reclaim a land that had been defiled. Noah's prophecy had been tragically fulfilled. By choosing the path of disrespect and rebellion, the line of Canaan had made itself a servant to sin and ultimately faced the consequences. And yet, even in the midst of the darkest judgment, the light of mercy never fully went out. The story does not end with total destruction. Consider Rahab, a Canaanite woman, a prostitute living in the doomed city of Jericho. When she heard of the power of the God of Israel, she did not choose defiance or fear. She chose faith. She hid the Israelite spies, professing her belief in a God she had never seen, and that faith saved her. When the city walls collapsed, her family was spared. But the story goes even further. Rahab was not just saved, she was adopted into the community of Israel. She married an Israelite man and became part of the royal line of King David. And, most astonishingly, her name is recorded in the genealogy of Jesus Christ himself. Do you see this stunning reversal? A woman from the cursed line became a mother in the lineage of the Messiah. What does this prove? It proves that Noah's prophecy was about spiritual choice, not an unchangeable destiny based on blood. Anyone, from any lineage, who turns to God in faith can break the chains of the past and be written into his story of redemption. The legacy of Canaan is a dual lesson, a solemn warning about the consequences of sin, and a hopeful promise of the transformative power of grace. After the judgment on the Canaanite kingdoms, it would be easy to assume that the story of Ham's lineage within the Old Testament narrative draws to a close. It might seem that one branch was pruned, and the others, though powerful, faded into the background as the focus shifted to the developing nation of Israel. But if we look closer at the historical tapestry woven by the scriptures, we find that golden threads from Ham's legacy continue to appear in the most unexpected places, playing pivotal roles and reminding us that God never forgets any of his children. These are not stories of empires or great wars, but of personal encounters, moments where faith and compassion transcended all boundaries of race and nation. They are the forgotten golden threads, proving that the descendants of Ham were not mere outsiders, but active participants in the sacred drama. Let us journey to the kingdom of Judah in its final days before the fall to Babylon. The city of Jerusalem was drowning in political corruption and religious decay. Kings had turned from God, and prophets were persecuted. In this dark setting, the prophet Jeremiah was thrown into a muddy cistern and left to die for daring to speak God's truth. The officials of the court, his own countrymen, had abandoned him. But who came to his rescue? Not a priest, nor a Judean soldier. It was a man named Ebed-Melech, a Kushite, an Ethiopian eunuch serving in the royal palace, a foreigner, a descendant of Ham. Risking his own life, Ebed-Melech courageously went before the king, pleaded Jeremiah's case, and was given permission to pull the prophet from the pit. His was not just an act of humanity, it was an act of faith, and God saw it. He sent a message to Ebed-Melech through Jeremiah, promising, "I will rescue you on that day, because you trust in me." In Judah's darkest hour, a son of Kush shone as a beacon of loyalty and righteousness. Is this not God's way of showing that the sacred line is determined not by blood, but by the heart? And we recall again the encounter between the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, an event mentioned before. But let us reflect more deeply on its meaning. The Queen, a descendant of Kush, did not come merely to listen. She came, she saw, she believed, and she glorified the God of Israel. She brought the wealth of her kingdom not as a boast, but as a gift to God's anointed king. She returned home, carrying not only answers to her questions, but a new understanding of the living God. Her visit was a prophetic foreshadowing of the day when the nations of the world would be drawn to the light of God. She represented the people from afar spoken of by the prophets, who would come seeking his wisdom. Once again, a person from the line of Ham stands at the center of a crucial prophetic moment. Even in more complex interactions, the mark of Ham's descendants is present. When Moses, the great leader of Israel, took a wife, whom did he choose? The book of Numbers records that he married a Kushite woman. This marriage caused jealousy and criticism from his own siblings, Miriam and Aaron. But God himself defended Moses, rebuking Miriam and Aaron for their prejudice. Why is this story recorded? Perhaps it is a powerful reminder that in God's eyes there is no racial hierarchy. He sanctioned the union between his chosen leader and a woman from the line of Ham. This challenges all prejudice and affirms that God's family is built on faith, not on ethnicity or skin color. These threads, Ebed-Melech, the rescuer, the Queen of Sheba, the seeker, and the Kushite wife of Moses, reveal a profound truth. The legacy of Ham was never truly stolen or written out of God's plan. It was merely obscured by human misinterpretation and prejudice. Throughout the Old Testament, God continued to work through individuals from this line, weaving stories of courage, faith, and acceptance. He was showing that in his house, there is always room for the children who come from the south, from the land of golden rivers and hearts that long to find him. If the Old Testament shows that golden threads of Ham's legacy survived and shone, the New Testament is where that legacy is fully reclaimed and gloriously redeemed. When the Messiah came into the world, he did not come for the nation of Israel alone. He came to break down every dividing wall, to invite all peoples into his kingdom. And in the most critical moments of the gospel story, the descendants of Ham appear once again, not as peripheral characters, but as deeply symbolic participants. Let us begin with Jesus himself. As an infant, where did he find refuge from the murderous rage of King Herod? His parents fled with him to Egypt, the land of Mizraim. History came full circle in a moment of profound meaning. The land that had once imprisoned the people of Israel now became a safe haven for their king. The Messiah began his earthly life as a refugee on the soil of Ham. Could there be a more powerful message of reconciliation and God's redemptive purpose for all nations? He sanctified that land with his very presence. Years later, during his public ministry, Jesus encountered a Canaanite woman, a woman from the very lineage that many Jews considered cursed and unclean. She came to him, begging for the healing of her demon-possessed daughter. At first, Jesus seemed to refuse, stating that he was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But this woman would not give up. With a humble yet persistent faith, she replied, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Her answer astounded Jesus. He praised her great faith for all to hear and healed her daughter instantly. In that moment, the wall between Jew and Gentile was breached. A Canaanite woman, a descendant of the cursed line, taught the world a lesson in tenacious faith. She proved that Noah's prophecy was not a permanent chain, and that grace is available to anyone who comes to the Messiah. And then we come to the darkest and most glorious moment in history, the Passion of Christ. On the sorrowful road to Golgotha, Jesus, exhausted from scourging, collapsed under the weight of the cross. The Roman soldiers, eager to get on with the execution, looked for someone to carry it for him. Whom did they choose? Not one of the disciples, for they had fled. Not a Jew from the jeering crowd. They compelled a man named Simon, a man from Cyrene, a city in North Africa, in the land of Put, a stranger, a visitor, a descendant of Ham. Simon the Cyrene was forced to carry the cross of the Savior of the world. Ponder this image. At the hour when the world seemed to turn its back on God, a son of Africa stepped in to share his burden. It is an act of staggering symbolic power. It represents the invitation for all nations to take up their cross and follow Jesus. The legacy of Ham, the line of warriors and survivors, now had a representative carrying the very instrument of humanity's salvation. Simon's sons, Rufus and Alexander, would later become known and respected members of the early church in Rome, personally greeted by the Apostle Paul. The story of redemption continues after the resurrection. In the book of Acts, we find another descendant of Ham playing a pioneering role. This is the Ethiopian eunuch, the son of Kush, whom we met before. After his baptism by Philip, he went on his way rejoicing, returning to his homeland. Tradition holds that he was the one who brought the gospel to Ethiopia, planting the first seeds for one of the most ancient and enduring Christian communities in the world. Do you see the full picture emerging? From the refuge in Egypt, to the faith of the Canaanite woman, to the service of Simon of Cyrene, and the mission of the Ethiopian eunuch, the legacy of Ham is woven into the very heart of the gospel story. They were not pitiful outsiders. They were active participants, chosen to play crucial, symbolic roles. At the foot of the cross, all curses are broken, every stolen legacy is reclaimed, and every nation is invited to become part of the family of God. Our story does not end in the 1st century. It does not stop with the final pages of the Bible. The legacy of Ham, redeemed at the foot of the cross, did not vanish into history. Instead, it quietly took root, grew, and in our own time has burst into a flame so brilliant it astonishes the world. The ancient prophecy of Psalm 68, that Ethiopia will quickly stretch out her hands to God, is being vividly fulfilled before our very eyes. While Christianity in the West, the lands of Japheth, faces decline and secularism, an extraordinary spiritual reversal is taking place on the continent of Africa, the lands of Ham. The seeds of faith planted by the Ethiopian eunuch, watered by the blood of the Alexandrian martyrs, and nurtured in the ancient monasteries of the Egyptian desert, have now grown into a vast forest of faith. Look at the map of global Christianity today. The center of gravity is no longer in Rome, Geneva, or London. It is shifting south to cities like Lagos, Kinshasa, and Nairobi. The nations of Africa, populated by the children of Kush, Mizraim, and Put, are becoming global centers of revival, prayer, and evangelism. Churches are rising not only in villages but in massive cities. Worship services draw tens, even hundreds of thousands, filling stadiums with thunderous songs of praise. The descendants of Ham, the line once mistakenly thought to be excluded from the promise, now stand at the forefront of the Great Commission. There is a beautiful and divine irony at play. History has come full circle. Africa, the continent that once received missionaries from Europe and North America, is now sending its own missionaries to the post-Christian West. The children of Ham are carrying the fire back to the places where the embers are growing cold. What has fueled this powerful reawakening? It is an unapologetic faith, a radical trust in the power of God's Word and the Holy Spirit. It is a faith that has been tested in the crucible of poverty, disease, war, and oppression. It is not a philosophical faith. It is a living, practical faith, deeply rooted in daily life. For many Africans, God is not an abstract concept, but a healer, a provider, and a deliverer whom they experience every day. And this legacy is not just about numbers. It is also about theological depth. Alexandria, in Egypt, was once one of the great intellectual centers of the early church, producing theologians like Clement and Origen. Today, African theologians are bringing fresh and profound perspectives to Scripture, shaped by their unique cultural and historical experiences. They are helping the rest of the world read the Bible with new eyes. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian bodies in the world, stands strong to this day. They claim to be the guardians of the Ark of the Covenant. Whether this is true or not, it speaks to a deeper truth. They see themselves as sentinels of an ancient and sacred heritage of faith. They are a living testament to the endurance of faith in the lands of Ham. So, what does the story of Ham teach us in the end? It teaches us that God's story is always full of surprises. He lifts up the humble and brings down the proud. He turns curses into blessings. He chooses the things the world considers weak to shame the strong. The legacy of Ham is not a story of shame, but an epic of resilience and redemption. It shows that no lineage, no people, is outside of his grand, overarching plan. As we look to the future, to the final scene described in the book of Revelation, we see a beautiful vision, a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, dressed in white, worshipping in perfect unity. In that crowd will be the descendants of Shem, of Japheth, and of Ham. There will be the children of Kush, Mizraim, Put, and yes, even those from the line of Canaan who turned to God through faith in the Messiah. All the rivers of humanity, whether they have flowed through valleys of splendor or canyons of sorrow, will finally merge into the ocean of God's presence. The legacy that was once stolen has been found, not merely restored, but glorified. And the fire from the ancient continent is blazing, reminding the whole world that God's story is not over, and the most glorious chapters may be yet to come.